It's time to catch up with Claire Redfield and her crusade against Umbrella in Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica was initially released in 2000 for the Dreamcast. However, like many games released for the then-dying Dreamcast, it had to be pushed onto other systems such as the GameCube and PS2. When it moved on to the PlayStation 2, it was renamed Code Veronica X. Although the only core difference between the original and the X version is that the X version has extended cutscenes and a couple of graphical enhancements. However, despite some of the more positive developments that were found in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Code Veronica takes the franchise slightly back a step rather than making improvements. Code Veronica begins with Claire Redfield still searching for her brother Chris, which leads her to an Umbrella facility in Paris. Claire is eventually captured by Umbrella and taken prisoner on Rockford Island. While imprisoned, another zombie outbreak occurs, and Claire is able to take advantage of the situation. As Claire tries to escape the fortress, she crosses paths with another prisoner named Steve Burnside, who is also trying to make his way off the island. Complicating the situation further is Alexander Ashford, who seems to think that Claire is the cause of the outbreak. In the midst of all this, there are more mysterious things occurring in the background, such as the location of Alexander's sister Alexia, and the return of an old enemy long thought dead. Unlike the three PlayStation games which placed most of the background information of the plot into text documents for the player to read, Code Veronica tells most of its narrative through cutscenes, as there are a lot more of them here than there has been in any past Resident Evil game. And Code Veronica is probably the first Resident Evil game to really put a focus on its story. Whereas the other games were just about putting you in a situation and having you escape from the experiments of Umbrella, Code Veronica's story is more mysterious and has a few more twists than its predecessors. However, Code Veronica might be seen as a turning point for where the Resident Evil series story started to get a tad complicated. This game does try to tie up some of the loose ends about Umbrella's experiments from the first three games, and it even brings back a supposed deceased character in order to tie up these ends. This plot is not terribly hard to follow, but as we'll see in the games to follow, there soon becomes a heavy focus on conspiracy theories, two-faced organizations, and characters that will act in illogical ways just to create an interesting plot twist. In addition to controlling Claire, you also get to play as her brother Chris. Unlike in Resident Evil 3 where you got to play as Carlos for a few minutes, the Chris section of the campaign is actually pretty lengthy. In fact, I'd say that about half the game you play as Claire and the other is Chris. The gameplay overall, though, is practically the same as it's been for the past three games, with a few questionable omissions. First off, the very handy auto-dodge feature has been removed, which means those blasted dogs are at it again. And you can't store multiple heal sprays into one pack or craft your own ammo. Other than that, though, it's business as usual. You still need to move around each area trying to solve puzzles to gain items to further explore your surroundings. Unlike in Nemesis, where the game kept pushing you forward and leaving you in a new area that you needed to explore in order to make progress to the next one, Code Veronica returns to more of the style found in Resident Evil 1 and 2. You still move on from location to location, but the backtracking between them is a bit on the heavy side this time around. The design is built around the concept once again of entering an area, exploring till you find the one door you can't move past, find something in the area to bring back to the previous area to find an item that you can use to get you back through the first area. So on an interesting note, when you're in control of Chris, you're in the same areas that you went through as Claire with slight differences, and this kind of helps as going through the same levels with another character would have been kind of repetitive overall. The biggest disappointment to Code Veronica is that being on a newer next-gen system at the time, it plays very much like its predecessors. Now, it's not an overall terrible thing, but Capcom took no real initiative to kind of improve the gameplay here. It's all the same, from the ink ribbon saving system to the storing bins to dump items, and now finally, after this many games, the same old mechanics are really starting to show their age, and they're kind of beginning to seep into the cracks and hurt the overall experience. The first three PlayStation Resident Evil games were very similar, but small changes were made from sequel to sequel. Code Veronica just improves how Resident Evil looks and not plays. I was in and I was hoping the game would bring out some new feature, but it never really happened. I mean, Resident Evil 2 played around with the idea of how the story was told by having you play as separate characters and having their actions affect each other. That kind of happens here, but not to a very overall worthwhile extent. Nemesis brought in a new type of enemy, one you couldn't easily run from, in addition to having new mechanics of crafting ammo and holding healing items. Code Veronica doesn't really have a highlighting feature in the gameplay department. Again, this isn't a bad thing by any means, it's just underwhelming that there's nothing really separating Code Veronica from the older titles at this point. They could have easily improved things like the sidestepping, the dodging, the shooting controls, and the inventory system, yet it's all too similar to what's come before. Although maybe that's not too surprising, as Resident Evil 2, 3, and Code Veronica were all developed on an annual basis, and so that doesn't leave a lot of time to make very worthwhile improvements. Though there is something vastly different from past Resident Evil titles to be found in Code Veronica, and a lot of that has to do with the level of difficulty, or rather the unfair design that this game tends to have during the second half in connection to the aging gameplay mechanics. There are numerous sections of where the game essentially becomes unwinnable, forcing you to either reload an earlier save, or God forbid having to start the game from scratch again. If you've used up all your herbs and are low on ammo, or you don't have ammo for the stronger guns, you're kinda screwed against some of the later bosses. And on your first playthrough, this is most likely gonna happen since you won't know where enemies spawn or which bosses you should be likely to engage in. And that's right, Code Veronica has several bosses that you don't even need to fire a shot at. Though the game doesn't make that very clear, so on a first playthrough, you're very likely to waste a crapload of ammo and herbs, shooting at bosses and enemies that you have no business dealing with, only to have this bite you in the ass later on. On my very first playthrough, you had to fight that giant worm in the courtyard, and so I unloaded clip after clip after clip, and used herb after herb, only to learn that this boss is optional until you play as Chris. So because of this, I became screwed later in the game when I got to the tyrant boss fight with Claire, and I had no ammo or herbs left, so I had to start the game all over again. Also, the bosses and some of the stronger enemies like the Hunter's Yokers come off as very annoying this time around, thanks in part to the tank controls. The enemies are fast and require some insane maneuvering if you want to dodge them. Take the aforementioned Tyrant fight. He can charge at Claire at breakneck speeds, and you're given like a millisecond to potentially move away, and frankly it borders on impossible. But you know what would be nice, Capcom? You know, if there was some type of an ability Claire and Chris could do to move out of the way, you know, like that handy sidestep from Resident Evil 3, you know, that mechanic that you morons chose to take out of this game? And look, I'll agree that the sidestep in Nemesis worked almost automatically, so it made these fights a hell of a lot easier in context, but I mean, you don't get rid of a decent mechanic, you could fix it so it's not that easy to use, like have it mapped to a button that the player needs to press at the correct time, this way there's some sense of strategy involved. Also, in connection to what I said before about the need to have a lot of ammo to take on the bosses, the controls in the aiming system make it very difficult to accurately hit anything, which has always been the serious problem, I know, but now, given the more open 3D environments that you're progressing through, this can lead you to waste a ton of ammo. And missing a target in Code Veronica hurts way more than it has in any past game, since you know that that one grenade or shotgun shell could have spelled the difference between victory and defeat later on. And even the shared storage bins can cause trouble late in the game. I've never really had a problem with the storage bins other than the fact that they're usually in a room, 20 miles back from, wherever you are at a given time, and that usually means you have to trek there to get the one item you forgot. But here it's a totally different story. For example, I was near the end of Chris's campaign when he rescues Claire, and I had him loaded with a grenade launcher, herbs, a magnum, and a shotgun. Then the game switches me unannounced to Claire, and I can't get access to any of these guns anymore since I left them in Chris's inventory and not in the storage bins. So I was a little peeved at first, but I thought no big deal. I mean, the game still gave me my handgun, it put me in a room with some herbs and pistols, so I'll just find some stuff as I go. But no more than 2 rooms later does the game throw another dick move at you by giving you no ammo and herbs at this point, and it has the nerve to throw a boss fight against the Jolly Green frickin' Giant here, which is unwinnable if you don't have any healing items. Now, one could argue that I should have had extra herbs and ammo already ready in the bin and ready to be taken out, but I mean, come on, think about it for a second. On a first playthrough, how would I have known that the game was going to throw me this curveball? I mean, my first time playing, I would have no idea. In fact, true story, I didn't think you got to play as Claire again when I first played this game, so I was just concerned with making sure Chris had all the weapons and ammo ready to take on whatever bosses lay ahead. I wasn't concerned with leaving things in the bins. So this difficulty really only exists on your first playthrough. These things act as beginner's traps, challenges that seem painfully absurd when you're on a second playthrough, and you know just how to prepare for the difficulty spots that lie ahead. Because I compared it, I played Code Veronica years ago on a first attempt and had to restart the game, and my more recent replays for this review, I didn't get stuck once. So it just shows you that these are beginner's traps, things that will only affect you the one time. But this all can come off as really cheap, and it's going to make you want to chuck your controller at the wall. The presentation is naturally a huge step up from the PlayStation games. Gone are those pre-rendered backgrounds and the world is now completely in 3D. The environments are striking and very diverse. There's a prison barracks, a residence, a mansion, an underwater base, and an Arctic base. The character models also look very nice and detailed, and facial features are finally well defined. Despite all this improvements to the graphics, the voice acting sadly has not taken that same step forward, which is a shame since Code Veronica has an interesting story that you might want to pay attention to, but probably won't because of the voice acting. Sadly, all of the voice actors this time are pretty pathetic, the one exception probably being Claire, who is, I gotta say, the best of the bunch. Not saying much, though. Steve is too whiny, and therefore you're never really gonna care about his character. Alexander's voice sounds more cheesy than a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and his sister Alexia sounds like your stereotypical British villain. She might as well be laughing and saying chip chip cheerio and sipping on a cup of tea at this point, if it was any more stereotypical. Also, the presentation is different depending on which version of this game you play. I would recommend playing any version over that more recently released HD version, as that version is awkward to say at the least. The FMVs in this version are hideous. and the in-game textures are not that sharp, and the lighting is way too dark in some places. I mean, seriously, if you look at the textures for Claire's outfit, it's kind of messy and dated. Her facial features look really sharp, but hair, clothing, it looks like it's just stitched on, and it doesn't look very, very slick. Here's a comparison scene from the HD version and the PS2 version, and I bet you'll spot the difference quite easily.
Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those
Shut up. Make one wrong move and I'll shoot.
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry. My name's Steve. Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those
Shut up. Make one wrong move and I'll shoot.
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry. My name's Steve.
I mean, I've seen a ton of HD re-releases in the last couple of years, and Code Veronica might be the worst looking one I've ever seen. So if you can, play it on the PS2, or if you can get your hands on it, the Dreamcast version. In the long run, Code Veronica is just another peg in the Resident Evil series. It's not terrible, nor is it particularly outstanding. I enjoyed my time with Code Veronica, but the more time I spent with it, the more I felt left down by the lack of any real improvements over the PlayStation titles. If anything, I would just simply say that Code Veronica is as good as those titles were, but with a nicer coat of paint. Code Veronica is shinier and slicker thanks to new hardware, but that can't distract from the lack of any real progress from a gameplay standpoint. I would recommend playing Code Veronica if you like the PlayStation games, and as we're going to see real soon, Code Veronica marks the penultimate game in the series to truly be defined as pure survival horror. So if you've been enjoying that genre in this series for this long, you might want to get your fill with this one. Anyway, come back next time when we get to go back to the past to see the true beginnings of this franchise when we look at Resident Evil 0.